Hi, good afternoon.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Doing all right, thank you. Well, let's get started and see if other people join at some point. So, last time we went over, I think, a fair amount of stuff in Lightroom. um, any questions on that before we go on? Anybody? No. Okay. Today, I think we have not, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but we have not yet talked about color temperature and white balance. Does that sound correct? We have not yet.
I think you started talking some about white balance, but that was it.
Okay.
A
Okay.
little.
Let's go over that. Um, so, when we go out in the world, we encounter different lighting situations: daylight, cloudy, in the shade, inside under, incandescent lights like the Edison style light bulbs, fluorescent lights. Um, and as we do that, our brains correct for those different situations. So a red, this strap that's kind of reddish coral, looks like that to us under daylight, under in shade, under incandescent light. It still looks about the same to us. Um, Films and cameras in general cannot correct for those different lighting situations, however. So if you guys have used color film in the past, maybe you've seen that when you use it inside under incandescent light, your images have a kind of orange color cast. And that's because that film was designed to be used under daylight. And when you use it under different types of light, you get a color cast. So I want to talk about light for a little bit, light and color. Um, so let me share this screen with you. So these notes are in your, they're on Canvas in the color temperature and white balance module under CETA's class notes. But here we go. So Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet are the colors of the rainbow. So these are the colors that we can see. The the sun, stars, the sun, put out light, and that's called the electromagnetic spectrum or the spectrum of light. And of that light that's put out, we can see a minuscule portion of it. And this is what we see. And these are wavelengths and particles. So light has the properties of both wave and particle. In photography, we deal with the wave phenomena. Uh, so each of these colors has a different wavelength. And wavelengths are the distance from peak to peak or trough to trough. And wavelengths can be enormous or they can be minuscule. So if you've ever been in an earthquake, maybe you've seen the earth going like that. And what you're seeing are the actual waves that were generated by the earthquake. So I was in Capitola during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, about to get onto Highway 1, and all of a sudden the ground started shaking, and I could see the overpass that goes over Highway 1 going like that. And so what I was seeing were the actual waves that were generated by the earthquake. These waves are so tiny that you can't see them. They're measured in nanometers. But each color has a different wavelength. And as I said, there's a lot of the spectrum of light that we cannot see on either side of red and violet. As we go towards the red portion of the spectrum and beyond, those are longer wavelengths. And then from, in this case, left to right, you can do it in either direction, the wavelengths get shorter and shorter. So we have encountered certainly some of these other wavelengths that we cannot see. Way past red in the longer portion of the spectrum are TV and radio waves, and then microwaves, which of course we use for heating food. Infrared, far and near infrared. So if you've ever seen movies like action movies or police movies where somebody has a rifle with a special spotting scope and you can see outlines of people in buildings, with like an aura. And what that is showing is the heat signature of a person. And infrared scopes can read the heat put out by objects or subjects. So that's what that's doing, or that's what those things do. Some films and our digital sensors are sensitive to the infrared portion of the spectrum as well, which we cannot see. And images can be made in infrared. So some subjects reflect a lot of infrared radiation, which we don't see. Human skin, foliage, the contrails made by airplanes. And when photographed, they look kind of otherworldly. They glow. Digital sensors are sensitive, as I said, to infrared wavelengths, and a filter is placed in front of the sensor so that those are not recorded. But photographers who want to photograph in infrared have that filter removed so that they can photograph in infrared. And then you go through the visible spectrum that we can see from red through violet, with the wavelengths getting shorter. And then on the other side, past violet, is ultraviolet, which we've, I think, all heard of. Ultraviolet radiation being damaging to us, to our skin, to plants, and so on. Beyond that, X-rays and other cosmic rays. So X-rays, we know, are often used for diagnostic purposes, also for radiation treatment for certain cancers. Beyond that, gamma rays, which are put out by radioactive isotopes and by the sun and stars. So as the wavelengths get shorter and smaller, and the particles smaller, they become more and more damaging to us. Okay, so that is the spectrum of light. And again, we deal with the visible spectrum of light, that which we can see. But we don't refer to the colors by their wavelengths in nanometers. We refer to them as colors, and they are also referred to by something called their color temperature. And so colors are measured and described in the Kelvin scale of temperature. So that's a color temperature scale. So it doesn't directly translate to hot and cold, for example, as do the Fahrenheit and centigrade scales. Though the Kelvin scale does have a relationship, or a more direct relationship, with the centigrade scale. So minus 273 degrees centigrade is 0 degrees Kelvin. And that is a theoretical point called absolute zero, when theoretically all molecular motion ceases. No one knows if you can actually reach that point, but you can come very, very close anyway. Not that we deal with absolute zero here in photography, but we do deal with the Kelvin scale. So the Kelvin scale was devised by Lord Kelvin. And he devised it by burning a black body, which for him was coal, and measuring the different colors at different temperatures. The Kelvin scale looks at color or deals with color in a way that is kind of the opposite of how we think of colors and describe colors. So when we see an image that has a lot of reds and oranges, gold in it, we describe that image as being warm, as having a warmth. And images that have a lot of blues and violets, greens, we describe as cool or cool toned. In the Kelvin scale, the reverse is true. So the higher the color temperature, the more blue the light, and the lower the color temperature, the more red. I've given you here some numbers to give you a sense of the Kelvin scale. And so here with very blue light, up at 11,000 or 10,000 Kelvin, the light is very, very blue. So in deep shade with absolutely no direct sun, the time just before sunrise or just after sunset, when the light is very, very violet. So if you're out at the beach just before the sun sets, as the sun gets lower, it gets more and more reddish and gold. And then immediately it drops below the horizon, the light completely changes and becomes this deep violet color, blues and violets. And if you happen to be awake when the sun is rising, the light, is again very, very purplish violet, and immediately the sun comes above the horizon, everything changes, and it's this beautiful golden, reddish golden light. So that color just before the sun rises or just after the sun sets has a very high color temperature. It's very blue. Just below that, or a little bit below that, at 8,000 Kelvin, is shade. So not quite as deep shade as at 11 or 10,000, but shade as, so for example, if you're in the shade of a building, that light also is pretty blue. Just below that, at 7,000 Kelvin, a cloudy day. So 8,000, if you have a very heavy cloudy day, rainy day where the clouds are coming down, that's at 8,000. At 7,000, it's a brighter cloudy day. So here today in Santa Cruz, it's foggy but bright. So the color temperature would be about 7,000 Kelvin. Below that is one of the biggies, and that is daylight, 5,500 Kelvin. And so roughly between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., with no cloud cover, and depending on the time of year and where on the globe you happen to be, that is daylight, and the color temperature is about 5,500 Kelvin. Electronic flashes, so those are the flashes that are built into your cameras. Those also are balanced to daylight, to 5,500 Kelvin. So if you use a flash inside, no matter what kind of lighting situation in which you're photographing, the areas that are struck by the flash will be daylight balanced. It will be, those areas will look as if they were photographed outside under daylight in terms of the colors. Below that, at 3,200 Kelvin, is called tungsten light, and that's, as we're going down in color temperature, the light gets more orangey. So tungsten light is somewhat more orange. In the past, if you have ever worked in a photo studio, those light bulbs are balanced to 3,200 Kelvin. Tungsten light is also referred to as incandescent light. So the Edison style light bulbs, like this, are called incandescent bulbs, and their color temperatures are actually usually a little lower than the tungsten, than 3200, but they're kind of dumped into that category. So in the past, bulbs were referred to by their wattage, by the output of electricity. Now they're referred to by lumens. So if you go and buy a bulb, it will tell you how many lumens are put out. And often it'll give you the wattage equivalent because that's what we all were used to. It will also give you the color temperature. So the bulbs that say soft light or warm light have lower color temperatures, so around 3200 or a little below. Daylight or neutral light will be at about 5500, and the ones that say cool light will be up around 7000. Below incandescent and tungsten at about 1900 Kelvin is candlelight. So, candlelight is really very orangey light, The lowest color temperatures that we can see are about 900 to 1000 Kelvin. So if you've ever seen lava or pictures of lava just before it cools enough so that it turns black, that really, really, really deep red, that's about the lowest color temperature we can see. So that is the color temperature scale, the Kelvin scale. You should have a sense of these and know the biggies anyway, of the color temperatures. So if you have color film, or if you have something called your white balance setting, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, white balance setting of your camera, your digital camera set to daylight, and you photograph under different lighting situations, as listed here, you will get a color cast. So the most commonly seen color cast is orange, when you photograph inside under incandescent light with daylight balanced film or your white balance set to daylight. If you photograph under fluorescent light with a daylight setting, you'll get this kind of ghastly yellowish green color cast. Under cloud cover, you'll get a bluish color cast. Under shade, you'll get a very blue color cast. In the past, when film was king, filters had to be used to correct for these color casts, to neutralize the white balance. And so I want to talk about filters for a little bit so that you have a sense of what happens when we change the setting called white balance. Color conversion filters were like the big guns of the filter world. Not used so much for tweaking colors if you think your image is a little bluish or a little orangey, but when you're getting a more major color shift because you have the wrong film or the wrong setting for the lighting situation. And as I said, the most commonly seen color cast is the orange color cast that you get, that is created by using a daylight balanced film or sensor setting under incandescent light. And to neutralize that, you would use a blue filter. So blue neutralizes orange, orange neutralizes blue. Less commonly seen is the blue color cast that's created by using a tungsten or incandescent balanced film or sensor under daylight. So you get this really kind of ghastly blue color cast. And to neutralize that, you would use an orange color conversion filter. So again, orange neutralizes blue. The light balancing filters are used more for tweaking. So if you felt your image was a little bit too bluish, you would use a pale to medium amber, not quite orange, but an amber filter. So number 81 filter. And if you felt your image was just a little bit too orangey, you would use a number 82 blue filter. So these again are more for tweaking rather than huge changes. To compensate or to correct for the ghastly yellowish green color cast that you get when using a daylight setting under fluorescent light, you would use a magenta filter. So magenta again is, it's a pinkish purple or purplish pink. And those filters are called FL-D filters. FL for fluorescent, D for daylight. And this magenta filter corrects for that yellow-green color cast. Okay. So again, those filters were used to correct generally for film using the incorrect film. So most color film is designed to be used under daylight, and if you look at the film, if you have any, it will say daylight and will probably say 5500 Kelvin, or often it would say 5000 Kelvin. Happily, in digital photography, we don't have to use filters. We can change something called the white balance. So some of you may have already been fiddling with your white balance settings, but to access the white balance menu, you can go into your menu and access that, or on the back, if you have an SLR, on the back of the camera there's usually a button that says WB for white balance. If you hold that in, then you can change the settings that you can see on the LCD on the camera. In the menu, you will probably have, well, you may have words, you may have icons, or you may have both. But these are the settings that are there: auto, daylight, incandescent, fluorescent, cloudy, shade, flash, and custom. So A for auto, and that's usually the default setting. And in the auto setting, the camera does its best to correct for color casts under different lighting situations. But usually setting the white balance to the specific lighting situation under which you're photographing will give you a more accurate compensation or correction. So daylight, usually you'll have a little sun icon. For incandescent or tungsten, some cameras say incandescent, others say tungsten, probably have a light bulb. For fluorescent, you'll have one of those fluorescent tubes. Some cameras have more than one fluorescent setting, depending on the intensity of the fluorescent effect. You'll have a cloud for cloudy, and usually a building casting a shadow for shade, a lightning bolt for flash, and a K, the letter K, for custom. So this allows you to set a specific color temperature if you so desire. So when you change your white balance setting from daylight to incandescent, it is as if you have applied a number 80 blue filter to compensate or correct for that orange color cast that you would get with a daylight setting under incandescent light. When you change the white balance setting to fluorescent, it's as if you are applying an FL-D filter, the magenta filter, to correct for that yellow-green color cast. When you set the white balance to to cloudy, it's as if you are applying a number 81 light amber or amber filter to correct for the bluish color cast that you get under cloud cover. When you set the white balance to shade, it's as if you are applying a number 85 orange filter to correct for the more intensely blue color cast that you get in shade or very heavy cloud cover. The flash setting in some ways doesn't make sense because why would you need to set the white balance to flash when the flash is already set to daylight? It's it is balanced to 5500. But when you put the white balance setting into flash, you'll see that your image has just a little bit more warmth in that it has a tiny bit more orange, yellow, gold in it than it otherwise would. And finally, the custom setting, again, if you want to set a specific color temperature, you can do so. Okay. So again, the white balance settings are very useful in that they correct for these color casts that you get, and you don't have to actually apply a filter. Now, it's not that there are little filters inside the camera, but the algorithms that are written here select for different color temperatures depending on the white balance that you have selected. If you shoot in RAW, in some ways it doesn't matter what you set your white balance to, because all of the information is already there and it remains there. So even if you have it set to an incorrect white balance setting, that information is not actually affected because everything is still there. However, if you shoot JPEG and you set the white balance incorrectly, you may have a bit more of a problem, because JPEGs are lossy in that some information is dumped. The other information will be tossed, because the assumption is you've set the white balance to what it's supposed to be, and so the other information is not necessary. So the JPEG image will be incorrect if you set the incorrect white balance. So, and it's not that you can't correct for it, but it's much easier not to have to. So it's something that you should pay attention to, especially if you're shooting in JPEG rather than RAW. Any questions? Anybody? Anybody? No? Okay, well, let me show you some images, and then we'll go from there. Sorry, just a moment. Okay, can you see the spectrum image? Anybody? Yes, no?
Yes, I can see it.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So this is what I just wrote out, reversed, so it doesn't matter which way, right to left, left to right. So here the ultraviolet is on the left, and it starts with the shorter wavelengths and goes across to longer, either way. So this stuff is the same, essentially. So the color temperature in general terms. So up here, very blue light at 11,000 Kelvin, no direct sun. And as the color temperature decreases, the light shifts from blue down into red. Okay. Finding the white balance, it depends on the camera that you have, but all of them, if you have an SLR, you should be able to go into the menu and find white balance. And when you do, you'll have something like this. So auto, incandescent, or tungsten, fluorescent, direct sunlight, or daylight. So some cameras refer to it as direct sunlight, others as daylight. Flash, cloudy, shade. And this one, and over here on the left, you have the option of setting a specific color temperature. So you may have icons, you may have words, you may have both. Okay. Okay, so just some images. You may wonder why I'm showing you paintings rather than photographs, uh, but I have my reasons. Um, this painting was made by an American painter named John Singer Sargent, who worked quite a lot in Paris, and this is entitled Madame X, and it's a portrait of a woman who is a socialite in Paris. She wasn't called Madame X, but she was fairly well known. And this image was, this painting was poorly received when it was made, I think in the 1870s. So, first of all, the gown was considered risque, even for Paris. Looked to people as if it was about to, you know, burst open or burst off. Uh, and then her skin tones were not appealing to people. So if you look at her skin, it has a sort of bluish violet cast to it. And John Singer Sargent actually put blues and violets into the paint when he painted her skin, but he didn't make it up. She actually put these colors subtly into her skin powder. And so that is how her skin looked. Notice her ear is red. I guess she didn't get her ear. But she did this. She liked this effect. But a lot of people did not and do not. And again, we respond on an emotional level to colors. And emotionally, we tend to favor, subconsciously, we favor images that have more reds and golds in them rather than blues and greens and violets. Not that we don't like those colors, but on an emotional level, we respond more favorably to those, quote, warm colors that actually have lower color temperatures. This painting was made by the Spanish painter Pablo Picasso during his blue period. But you can see, I think, that he was aware of something that we don't pay that much attention to consciously, and that is color temperature and shade, and the colors that we see depending on the lighting situation in which we are. And so he painted that. He was aware of shade and lack of sunlight and what it does to the color cast of that situation. So we have this woman in a room. You can see there's some sunlight coming in, and it illuminates this. I guess it's like a chest covered with cloth, and a little bit of her. You see the sun hitting her head, but the rest of the room is blue. And it's not that there aren't colors in there, but they all have a bluish color cast. So he was obviously quite aware of this, this thing that we don't pay that much attention to on a conscious level. This painting is like the opposite. It is so warm. It is a painting by a man named Thomas Kinkade, painter of light, trademark. And in the past, maybe you saw many of his studios in malls and so on. And
I just did one of his Disney puzzles.
no way, really? Excellent.
It was a 1,000-piece puzzle, and it was winter.
Oh
and
my
holy crap!
That's excellent.
Right before you said, I'm like, Thomas Kinkade.
Exactly. You can see I lifted it from
Oh,
a Russian website, so it's in Cyrillic up here.
I'm like, what's he hiding in here? Because he always has little hidden things. It was a Disney one I did, but yeah.
So
sorry.
No, that's great. His painting. This is representative, I would say, of almost all of his paintings. They are almost all done around twilight. They deal with little villages or hamlets, you know. Um, and they have these kind of, they're like gingerbread type or style houses and buildings. There are always lots of chimneys. Every single one is going. There's almost always a church or some religious building with a cross. There's usually a little body of water, and every window is illuminated with this yellowish golden light. It's like a PG&E dream come true. You know, every light is on, and the the color temperature, the color of those windows is really important. So this is the kind of color cast actually that you get when you shoot daylight film or daylight setting under incandescent light. But this color, it to us it indicates warmth, you know. So we have the sense of coming home at the end of a day. It's twilight, and all of these buildings are so welcoming, you know, because they have this golden light, you know, that invites us in. And I think it's kind of this holdover, you know, from hundreds of thousands of years of needing protection, and the safety and protection of fire, you know, and that color. And I think that's really very ingrained in us. And so these images by Kincaid are really designed to pull us in, to, you know, to evoke an emotional response based on comfort and safety and security. And had every light in these buildings been fluorescent and given off a kind of bluish or, you know, greenish cast, we would not be pulled in and attracted in the same way. So this image, it is bluish violet, which, you know, it's not that appealing, but it doesn't really repel us. It doesn't look unnatural per se until we see this same scene with the quote normal color, you know, white balance. And so seen side by side, you can see a huge difference. And now the blue one looks just wrong, you know. Here, doesn't this guy look like Cory Booker? Anyway, this light source, it said it was incandescent. I think that there's at least some fluorescent in there. It's so yellow, you know. But at any rate, whichever it is, the image on the left is shot with a daylight sensor, or set white balance setting for the sensor, and then the image on the right is corrected, and you can see there's a huge difference between them. And one way to tell, the one on the left obviously has a color cast, but if it's more subtle, one way to tell if there is a color cast is to look at the whites. And if the whites have a little bit of color, either, you know, orange or green or yellow or blue, that tells you that you're getting a color cast, even if it's not quite as obvious in other areas. So this one isn't so great. Let me do this one. This is what happens if you change the white balance setting under daylight. So because these other white balance settings are designed to compensate for different lighting situations, When you change the white balance under daylight, you'll get these color casts, just as you get color casts under different lighting situations if your white balance is set to daylight. So to the left of daylight, the shade white balance was used, and you can see it's really orange because shade has a very pronounced blue color cast. And so a lot of orange is used to compensate for that, to neutralize it. Cloudy, the next one to the left, is somewhat orangey, but not as orangey as shade, because cloud cover will give you a blue color cast, but not as intense as shade. Flash, again, the flash you expect to see the same as daylight, but it has just a little bit more orange or gold in it than straight daylight setting. Fluorescent is this magenta color. Because the fluorescent filter that's used to correct for the yellow-green color cast is magenta, when there is no yellow-green, it makes the image kind of purple, violet or purple. And finally, all the way to the left, tungsten. So when you're shooting with a daylight filter or setting under tungsten or incandescent light, you get an intensely orange color cast. And blue is used to correct for that or neutralize it. When that orange is not there, you can see it makes the image completely blue. And to a certain extent, the white balance, changing the white balance or tweaking it is a matter of taste. You may want a little more or less orange in your image, but very, very few people want their images to be intensely blue like this tungsten, or purple as with the fluorescent under daylight. Let me go to this one. So different lighting situations and the color cast. So to the left, under sunlight, there isn't really a color cast. The shadows are kind of harsh, but the skin tones, the colors look pretty natural. The second to the left, under sunlight at 5 p.m., you can see that the light is a little more yellowy, a little more yellowy orange, and not quite as harsh, because the sun is lower in the sky and you get a little bit more orange or gold in the light. In open shade, the center image, it's violet. It's kind of purple, and so we don't necessarily notice it that much when we're standing in shade, but this is the actual color of the light under shade. The second from the right, under tungsten or incandescent light, you can see has an intensely orange color cast. In fact, even the whites of the eyes are orange. And finally, to the right, the far right, fluorescent light. You can see that yellowish green color cast. It's kind of ghastly, ghoulish, and people tend to look kind of corpse-like or zombie-like. And there are some photographers who like that effect, but the vast majority do not. And it's not, let's say it's not classically flattering, And so most photographers will correct for almost all of these color casts. As you can see, I lifted this image from Schneider Optics. Schneider is a German optics company. They make high-end optics. They're very good lenses and filters. To the left, made without a filter, and to the right with an 82 filter. So the 82 filters are blue, and this corrected for the orangey color cast that you get under incandescent light and neutralized it. In fact, it it's almost a little blue, and perhaps that's just in comparison with the image on the left, but it's, well, let's just say it's very neutral. Okay, any questions? Anybody? Anybody? No? Okay, well, so that is the lecture portion, I guess, and the picture portion of color, temperature, and white balance. And I will talk about the assignment in a few minutes. But if there are no questions, I want to discuss a couple of filters. So we kind of talked about filters with the color, temperature, and white balance, and said that we don't need to use them for changing white balance because we have the white balance settings in our digital cameras. But I want to talk about two filters, the effects of which cannot be affected or actualized by just changing settings on the camera. You have to physically have this the filters. So let me just go back here. So the first filter I want to talk about is the polarizing filter. Polarization of light, which appears to us as glare and reflection, occurs when there's an overabundance of light traveling on one plane. And so I'm sure that you've been on or near bodies of water at certain times of day when the water is so bright, there's so much glare that you can't see anything that's in the water. All you see is this brightness. And I'm sure you've been in situations where you've walked by a window and all you see is a reflection of what's outside, so much so that you can't see into the window. So those things occur when the light is polarized. So polarizing filters were devised to reduce this effect. So the polarizing filters have embedded in them something called a microcrystalline grid. You can't see it, it's micro, but it disperses the light that's traveling along that plane. And so you need to actually rotate the filter until you see a change in the glare and or reflection. So most polarizing filters come in circular brackets that you screw onto the end of your lens. There are also filters that are just gels, and you buy a bracket that you screw onto the end of the lens, and then you can buy any number of gels to swap out. But most people use the polarizing filters that you screw onto the end of the lens. And these filters have two circular brackets. So you screw one onto the end of the lens, and then the bracket that actually has the filter in it rotates. And as you do this, you can see the glare and or reflection change and disappear. In addition to reducing glare and reflection, which is the main purpose of polarizing filters, they also increase color saturation. That is, they make the colors more intense, and they darken the sky relative to other elements in the frame. So they don't darken the entire image, but the sky appears darker and more intense relative to the other elements in the frame. So if you've seen images of, that were made in the mountains, for example, and the top area of the sky is such a dark blue that it appears black, and then you have this gradient going down, to a lighter blue. that image was almost certainly made with a polarizing filter. Excuse me. There are two types of polarizing filters, linear and circular. Linear polarizing filters were the first polarizing filters, and they work very well at doing these things. However, they interfere with the metering systems, the split beam metering systems that are found in electronic cameras. And if you use a linear polarizing filter with these cameras, which is, virtually all, excuse me, some bug here, virtually all newer cameras, your images will be underexposed by 2.5 stops, which is a lot. They'll be way too dark. If you're aware of this, you can set the camera to always overexpose by 2.5 stops to compensate for that. But you have to remember that you've done that, or if you forget and take the polarizing filter off, then your images will be overexposed by 2.5 stops. So circular polarizing filters were devised, and these filters have built into them something called a wave retardant, which sounds kind of like a flame retardant, but anyway, a wave retardant that neutralizes that effect, the effect that the linear polarizing filters have on the split beam metering system. Naturally, circular polarizing filters cost a lot more, and some people feel that they don't work as effectively. However, that's probably what you'll want to get unless you're using a manual camera. Okay. So any questions on polarizing filters? Anybody? No? So some of you may have polarizing sunglasses, and those the purpose of those is the same, that is to reduce glare and reflection. Okay. So one last filter I want to talk about, and that filter is called the neutral density filter. And these filters reduce the overall amount of light entering the camera. So the other filters we talked about, the color conversion filters, light balancing, the fluorescent daylight filters, block certain wavelengths of light, certain colors, and allow other colors to be transmitted. The neutral density filters block the entire visible spectrum. Not entirely, they let light in, but they reduce it across the entire spectrum. You may ask why you might want to do that. Well, let's say you're photographing outside on a bright sunny day, but you want to show motion, and you want shallow depth of field. So in order to show motion, you need to use a slow shutter speed, and slow shutter speeds let in more light. In order to achieve shallow depth of field, you want to use a large aperture. Excuse me. So we said that the primary way that we as photographers change depth of field is by changing the size of the aperture. So in order to achieve shallow depth of field, we would use a large aperture, which lets in more light. Normally, if we think of our equivalent exposures, when you use a fast shutter speed, when you use a slow shutter speed, which lets in a lot of light, you'll compensate by using a small aperture, which lets in less light. When you use a large aperture, which lets in a lot of light, you'll use a fast shutter speed, which lets in less light. In this case, we want to use both a slow shutter speed and a large aperture, both of which let in a lot of light. And we're in a situation where we have a lot of bright light. So generally, with that much light coming into the camera, even when we use a less sensitive ISO rating like 100, that's not enough to compensate for all of this light coming in. So either the camera just won't allow us to do that, or the images will be horribly overexposed. So we can use neutral density filters to reduce the overall amount of light entering the camera, which it would make it as if we're shooting like later in the day or at night. So by reducing the amount of light entering the camera, we can make use of both the larger apertures and the slower shutter speeds. So neutral density filters come in different intensities, described in stops, although, well, I should say they come in different stops. They are described differently, 0.3, 0.6, 0.9, 1.2, etc., referring indirectly to how many stops of light they block. And you can stack them if you want. So if you had all of these filters, 4, 3, 2, 1 stop filters, and stack them, you would block 10 stops of light, which is a tremendous amount. It would be as if you're photographing in the middle of the night. So it would really allow you to make use of the slow shutter speeds and large apertures. Okay. So those are two filters, the effects of which you cannot affect or mimic by changing settings on the camera. You have to physically apply the filters. And there are many other kinds of filters around, many special effects filters, which I'm not going to talk about here, but which are there definitely. Haze filters, soft focus, different colors, starburst filters, any number. But these filters are used for more technical reasons. Any questions? Okay, let's just look at a few images here. A few more images, I should say. So the polarizing filter, if we look at the image in the upper left, we see this car with a woman behind the window, barely visible, because really what we see is the reflection on the window of trees. So no filter was used there. If we look at the lower image, with the use of a polarizing filter, it's as if the window was rolled down. And we have to assume it wasn't. But there's absolutely no reflection visible on the window. And even if the window was rolled down, we can see that other reflections have disappeared too. So on the rear window here, the side of the car, all of this reflective stuff that we see in the upper image is gone in the lower image with the use of the polarizing filter. To the right, it's just somebody holding the polarizing filter in front of water that has a lot of glare and reflection. And you can see the difference, certainly in the color of the water. It gets rid of that glare that actually is light gray in this image. It becomes a very dark gray. The colors also are greatly intensified, though unfortunately we can't really see what's beyond. Anyway. This is someone holding one of the gel filters up in front of the camera at the Devil's Tower, or the Devil's Post Pile, it's sometimes called. And you can see that the sky is much darker. The lower part of the image, you can just see where the filter, where the filter is and isn't. But by and large, the tones here, the colors are the same, or the tones in terms of light and dark. the foreground, the area, this hill with the trees and so on, are about the same in terms of light and dark, but the sky is most definitely a darker blue, more intense. This shows, I think, an interesting effect of the polarizing filter, and may or may not be desirable, depending on what you're trying to show here. So on the left, the image was made without a polarizing filter, and so you can see all these little areas where there's some water, where it's reflecting. So it's on the rocks, but it's not. There's not a whole lot. It's not fast flowing. And with the use of the polarizing filter, all of those areas just disappear. You wouldn't know that there's water there at all. It's just gone. So it's really, in a way, it's a very different image. It really isolates the waterfall and really emphasizes the difference between the areas where there's water and then the areas where there's moss, the rock with the beautiful green moss on them. Neutral density filters, showing you how much light is blocked. So remember, each stop either increases the amount of light by 2 times, or decreases it to 1/2. So this, you start here with one stop is blocked, then 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so the light is cut in half, and then in half again, and in half again, and so on. So you can see with this filter all the way to the right, it's as if it's nighttime. So you'd have to use a much slower shutter speed and a larger aperture to get an exposure that looks more like one of the ones on the left. Okay. And finally, again with the neutral density filter, in the set on the top, this shows what happens with depth of field. So on the left, the upper left, the photographer, because there's so much light, the photographer was presumably forced to use a small aperture and let in less light. With the use of a neutral density filter, the photographer was able to open up the aperture, which allowed him to show more shallower depth of field, isolating the foreground, the subject, from the background. In the lower set, this shows the effect of the neutral density filter on the shutter speed. So in the image on the lower left, the photographer was presumably forced to use a fast shutter speed because there's so much light. With the use of the neutral density filter, which decreases the amount of light entering the camera, the photographer was able to use a slower shutter speed, letting more light in, thus showing the motion of this waterfall, of the water going over the falls, and showing this blur of motion rather than stopping or freezing the motion as on the left. Okay. Okay, any questions? Any questions on those things?
I kind of have a question, but I actually, while you were talking about it, I was looking because I have this really older lens, and I actually have a Sunpack UV extra light filter thing on it.
Oh, a UV filter?
Yeah, I know we bought separate for you just screw it on the lens and there it is. Yeah, it's a Sunpack UV, so it's light, and I'm like, huh.
I'm glad you brought that up because I forgot to mention that. So in the past, many photographers used UV filters or UV haze filters because although we can't see ultraviolet wavelengths, films and digital cameras are sensitive to them, and they appear in images kind of as haze. So it makes things that are a little further away look softer and not quite as definite. And
This
so,
was purchased for my film camera originally.
right,
So it's my
right.
film camera lens that I put on my digital, and it
Hmm.
has that.
So modern
I like that. That's
lenses,
cool.
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, okay.
No, just saying that's cool because it was, for the film one, but I put it on the digital camera now too because it's interchangeable
Great.
lenses. So.
Yeah, in the past, these were used to block the ultraviolet wavelengths, but modern lenses are coated, and so they pretty much, correct for that. However, um, many photographers still use UV haze filters to protect the outer element of the lens, so that you have something between the lens and the world. So, you know, pets, children with greasy, icky hands, whatever, all of these things can get on the outer element of the lens, can damage that, and filters are relatively inexpensive, and lenses are expensive, so it makes sense to protect the outer element of the lens. And so I certainly recommend getting either a UV haze filter, or there are also ones called, I think, skylight filters, that essentially do nothing but are optically pure. The glass is optically pure, and they protect the outer element of the lens. Okay. Okay, so that's that in terms of color, temperature, white balance, and a few filters. So I want to talk about the assignment for this, which it will not be due till the end. I mean, we only have a little more, about 2 weeks left. So I'd like you to get all your work in by the end of the term, which is next Friday. Here's my cat visiting. So that is June 26th. And so again, that's the end of the term. So let me bring up this assignment. Share screen. Can you guys see this? Yes? No?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. I'm never sure, So here's what I want you to do. I want you to find these different lighting situations. So I've listed them here. Daylight, which is pretty easy. Incandescent or tungsten light. So the types of bulbs most of us still have in our homes. The Edison style light bulbs or the equivalent. And that would be in terms of color temperature, which the new bulbs will tell you. Fluorescent light. Some of us use fluorescent light in our homes, some don't. You'll certainly find fluorescent lights in stores, in classrooms, but we're not in classrooms right now. Most stores use fluorescent lights. Cloudy. You may not be able to find cloud cover depending on where you live. So I live in Santa Cruz and it's often foggy here, but if you're, further north and inland, you may not have cloud cover. That's okay. Shade. You can all find shade. And then using the flash. So 3 of these will be made indoors: incandescent, fluorescent, and flash. And 3 outside: daylight, cloudy, and shade. Let me talk about the indoor ones first. So for each set, I want you to make 2 images. And the first image is to be made with the white balance set to daylight. Not auto, but daylight. And so if you're inside under incandescent light, and you shoot with the white balance set to daylight, you will get an orange color cast. So you'll make one image like that, and then you'll make the second image in the same place of the same thing with the white balance set to incandescent or tungsten. And so that image should show that this color cast has been neutralized. And you're going to do the same thing for fluorescent, but instead of using the incandescent white balance setting, you'll use fluorescent. So you make one image under fluorescent light with the white balance set to daylight, and the second with it set to fluorescent. Number 6 is flash. So in this situation, you'll photograph indoors and you'll turn your flash on. For all of the other images, you'll have the flash off. But here you will turn the flash on. And in the first image, you'll have the white balance set to daylight. And the second image, you'll have the white balance set to flash. And the difference will be subtle, but you should see it. Okay. For the outdoor images, under daylight or direct sunlight, this is the only case in which I want you to use the auto setting of the white balance. So you'll make two images, one with the white balance set to daylight, and the second with it set to auto. The second outside situation is cloudy. So if you happen to find cloud cover, do this. Otherwise, you can do another shade image. So with the first image, you'll have the white balance set to daylight, and you should see that the image is somewhat bluish. And in the second image, you will set the white balance to to cloudy, and you should see that the image or the colors are somewhat neutralized, the white balance. Under shade, you'll do the same thing. So one image made with the white balance set to daylight, and the second with the white balance set to shade. In shade, right? So you have to find a shady area, maybe in the shade of a building, or under trees or something like that. Okay? So you're going to make 6 sets of 2 images. And again, in one, you'll have the white balance set to daylight, and the second, you'll use the specific white balance setting for the type of lighting under which you're photographing. Do not use the flash except for number 6 in the flash section. Do not use the auto setting except in number 1, the daylight section. In order to submit the images, this depends on if you zip your images or you don't. I hope that you will try zipping them, because it's easier and easier to see them and know what they are, for me anyway. So I want you to make a folder, again, entitled with your name. And within that folder, you're going to make 6 separate folders, each entitled with the type of lighting situation. So cloudy, daylight, etc. Within each folder, you'll place your images. And I want you to retitle or entitle the images according to the lighting situation and the white balance setting that you used. So here I have it, the cloudy images, and the first one says cloudy-cloudy WB. And what that means is the lighting situation was cloudy and the white balance was set to cloudy. The second image says cloudy-daylight WB, and what that means is it was also made in a cloudy lighting situation, and the white balance was set to daylight. So I want you to do that for each of these sets, not cloudy for each of them, obviously, but for the specific lighting situations. And then, hopefully, you will zip the image and submit it to Canvas as a zip. If you cannot zip your images, you will probably have to submit each one individually. Please make sure that you entitle the images so I know what they are for. Does that make sense, everybody? So I will post this. I will post this so you can see it. And let me just bring up one more thing. Huh. It's odd. Oh, I know what happened. Sorry. Okay, sorry. Okay, so here are examples of this. So these are images made by other students, this class. So this first set, the lighting situation is cloudy, and the image on the left shows that the white balance was set to daylight, and so you get a slightly bluish cast to the image. And then on the right, the white balance was set to cloudy, and you can see that there's a lot more yellow, gold, orange in it, perhaps even too much, but you can see the difference in these images. So presumably cloudy is closer to the correct color temperature, color white balance than the image on the left. This image shows, these images, I should say, shows an incandescent or tungsten lighting situation. And the image on the left was made with the white balance set to daylight. And you can see that the whole thing is kind of orangey orange. Orangey orange. The image on the right with the white balance set to incandescent is much more toned down. There are a lot of yellows in the image, but you're now able to see the subtle differences in these other colors that you really couldn't see very well with the white balance set to daylight. In this set, the light source is fluorescent, and on the left, the white balance set to daylight, and you can see this icky kind of yellowish green or greenish yellow color cast. And on the right, with the fluorescent white balance setting, that is neutralized. Still a strange image, but anyway, it's neutralized, and you can see that the whites are neutral, not this yellowish, icky yellow-green. In this case, the light source is shade, and under daylight, with the daylight white balance setting, it's pretty blue. And if you look at the whites, there are blues in the whites. Now the shade white balance setting actually, in my opinion, goes a little too orange. And I've often found that to be the case with the shade white balance, that even if I am photographing in deep shade, often the shade white balance is a little too orange. But at any rate, this image was made in the shade, and this is the corrected, quote, corrected white balance with the shade. Light source daylight. So the difference between daylight and auto white balance settings, and you can see there's a difference. The auto adds a little bit more orange or gold to the image. And finally, flash, maybe in some ways a poor example, because there already is a whole lot of orange and red, or orange in the image. The image on the left was made with the white balance set to daylight, and you can see that the whites are relatively neutral, whereas in the image on the right with the white balance set to flash, there is more orange in the whites, and that's what the flash white balance tends to do, is it adds just a little bit more orange gold to the image. So, any questions? Any questions on white balance, on the assignment? Anybody? No?
Oh, I'm sorry. I have one really quick.
Please, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we can do the same image under the same lighting, but at different light balance settings.
In fact, that's what I
wanted to make
want you
sure
to
I heard
do.
that correctly.
Yeah, I want you to do that.
Okay.
So the same image twice,
Okay.
you know, one with daylight,
Right.
and with the exception, of course, of the daylight or the situation, daylight, and one with the white balance for that specific lighting situation. Right.
Okay. I think I got it because I almost went and redid it. I already did it, but I thought I misunderstood it. And then I was going to go take different images under different lighting situations.
So did these examples help?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. That's why now I thought I think maybe I did it correctly.
Well, you can always resubmit them if you want.
If I
Okay.
misunderstood.
Absolutely. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Great. Thanks.
Absolutely. So, Lightroom. I know we're getting late here, but I'd like to just reiterate some stuff about Lightroom, because I feel, I bet you feel, as if we haven't actually, we've gone over stuff and gone over it several times, or more than once, but I don't know if you feel that we've actually gotten very far with Lightroom. So let me just get back to that for a few minutes. So there we go. So we worked on some of these images using using the tools that we discussed in the develop module in Lightroom. So and we did get to talk about all of them, so I'm glad about that. In this image, you guys can see this, right? This flower, the iris. Yes? No? Anybody?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Good. So in this image, I believe that we used this tool called the adjustment brush. And so when I activate it here under the histogram, there are these tools. The adjustment brush is the one to the far right. If you like to use keystrokes, the letter K will get you there. And then when I activate that and bring my cursor over to the image, I can see these 3 gray circles, and that indicates that I worked in 3 different areas. And when I click on one, I activate that one. If I put my cursor over it, I can see what I've worked on because a mask, an overlay, will come over it. That is when I put my cursor over that circle. If I always want to see that overlay, I can go up to the tools, the pull-down menu that says Tools, and go down to Tool, Adjustment Mask Overlay. Sorry, If I always want to see it, I go to Tool Overlay and go to Always Show. Sorry, that's for the tool. For the overlay, sorry, I don't know what happened to my brain there. For the overlay, if you always want to see the overlay while you're working, if you use the letter O, the key O, that will keep this overlay on. And then you can work with it there. I find that that's helpful when I'm, if I come in close and I want to touch things up. I find it's helpful to see what's been done. So maybe I want to add a little here, or maybe subtract. So remember, to subtract, I can hold down the Option key, and now I get this minus sign, and I can subtract or get rid of some of what I've done. And then if I want to get rid of the overlay, just hit the letter O again. So I came in close by going over to the navigator on the left, and I clicked on 1-to-1. If I want to go back to full frame, I can click on Fit. I can also just click on the navigator and then double click to get back to the full frame. So these hatch marks of where I've worked always remain. I can always go back in and undo or add or whatever I want to do. Now, how did I do that? That's, oh, I see what I did. Well, anyway. I see. Okay. So I can go back into any of these areas and redo or subtract or add new, a new brush. So I go over, in order to do that, I go over to the right to the tools, controls, and where it says new, I click on new. And let's say I want to make these highlights darker. I can bring the exposure down and bring down these highlights. Like so. And maybe I want to bring down the highlight slider as well. I can adjust the color temperature within. That looks terrible, doesn't it? Again, if I don't like it, I can just double click on the slider and it zeroes it out. So that's the adjustment brush. We then, let's see, before that we used the radial filter, and which image did we use that on? Maybe this one. Yes. So this image, I'll do a before and after. So that's the letter Y. On the left before and on the right after. And so I can see that I lightened everything overall, I think, but maybe a bit, but really worked on specific areas. So here and then here. I guess that's it for there. So again, that's in the radial tool, and the radial tool, get out of that. Gives you an oval, which you can make a circle or any different sort of ovoid shape. So you can move it around and change the size and shape. And we have to remember that unless we invert it by clicking the invert button at the bottom, it's not inside the selected area but outside that's affected. So if we want that, that's fine. If we want to work on what's inside the selection, we have to click on invert. And then maybe I want to make that area lighter, like so. Yeah, that works. Maybe open up the shadows a little bit more. Not too much though, because I still want it to be darker than the background. So that's great. I like that. And maybe I'll make a new one over to the right. And again, I have to invert that. And so that you can see as I move it, it changes the affected area. Okay, so that kind of works for me. Now I see that I have lightened these leaves, which I don't necessarily want. So I'm going to go back to the tool controls and click on brush, and then click on erase, and that allows me to erase what I just did over there. So I don't necessarily want that area to be lighter, just the upper area. Okay. And maybe I find this sky area a little too bright, so I'll darken that back down again. Okay. Okay. So that is the radial tool. And I need to remember, of course, to get out of the tool. So I can click on Done down here on the lower right, or I can click on this tool again, either way, to get out of that. We use the gradient or graduated filter on this image. So I think I just did 2 areas, but you can see these 2 gray circles, and I activate one, and this shows what I've done here. And if we look at the tool controls on the right, you can see that the sliders are all over the place. So I greatly reduced the highlights, I opened up shadows, I increased exposure. Come on. All right, hang on. Sorry. Come on. All right, so. And then with this other area I worked on, I reduced the highlights and I opened up the shadows. So, and again, I can see the overlay of what I worked on. Okay. And we then, let me get out of that, worked on red eye and pet eye. Back. So using this tool here, red eye. So, oops. Like so, you just click in here, and then you can adjust the pupil size. With the slider, you can lighten or darken as you like. And the pet eye is the same, the same thing, but it corrects for that, the glow of pet eyes. And finally, let me get out of that, sorry. We worked with the spot removal tool. And the spot removal tool has two areas, or two things we can do, clone and heal. The healing is used usually for removing spots and things like that. The clone tool could be used for that, but is also used just to repeat things. So I repeated this, this wall decoration. There was just one, but I made a second one and pulled it down. Then in this area, let me come in closer, sorry. So here I used the healing. Here we go. So in these areas, you can see that I corrected for these come on. Sorry. Of course, I lightened everything too, but these dots and blemishes on the skin. Okay. So again, the clone tool used for actually copying things and putting them in other places. The healing tool designed to blend things, essentially. Now, one more thing before we go our merry ways, and that is dealing with all of this noise and stuff that you can see here. So if we look at this, the face, you can see that it's actually made up of all these blobs of colors that really don't belong there, greens and, and it looks blotchy and pretty bad. And so that's an important one that I want to go over. And so we deal with that in this area here called detail. So before that, if you recall, I told you that the first thing you should do is go down here in lens corrections and click on remove chromatic aberration, which it looks as if I did not do. So let's take a look at that. So when I do that, if you look closely at these edges, there are these color lines around here. that decrease. They don't disappear, but they decrease when I click on Remove Chromatic Aberration. And so it's generally a good idea to click on that. That said, let's go back to this detail area and go to noise reduction. So there are two kinds of noise in a way. One dealing with these blobs of color, and the second dealing with what's called luminance. And you tend to get more noise and blobs in dark areas, or you also get it, I should say. So let's deal with color first. So if you look down here under noise reduction, the second one is color, and you're going to pull the slider just until those blobs of color disappear. So if you watch, I don't have to move it too much before the greens and oranges disappear, and I'm going to stop there. And then I'm going to go to luminance, and I'll pull it across until I see a decrease, again, in the overall noisiness. But you see, if I go too far, you see what happens. It gets really, really smoothed out. Now, if you're photographing an aging movie star, maybe you want to do that, you know? So this actually looks kind of nice and flattering, certainly as opposed to that, right? So it's up to you how much you want to do. But you don't want to go nuts, generally speaking, right? So maybe I'll pull it to here. And then I can still see a few blobs of color, so I'll keep going a little bit more. And that looks much, 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 much better. So here's how it was before I did anything with noise reduction. And so I've gone back in the history on the left to show what it looked like before. And here's how it looks now. And then I can go back to fit to see the full frame. And that looks much better. And though I was just looking at her face because that's where you saw the most of that, the noise and the color aberration, what I did affected the entire image. Okay. Sharpening above noise reduction is something you want to do judiciously because it can look really kind of funky. And if you've just spent a lot of time doing noise reduction, you probably don't want to do sharpening because that kind of brings back some of the noise. So in some ways, it's an either or. Not always, but often, if you've done a lot of noise reduction, you probably don't want to do sharpening because it brings back the noise or some of the noise. Okay. Okay. Any questions on these? So after I've done that, I may want to come back to the basic area, and maybe I haven't, in an image that doesn't need as much work, I would just do this earlier. But now I want to look at what's called presence. So I worked on exposure. I could bring down the highlights maybe a little bit. I can open up the shadows a little bit. And then down in presence, I don't usually do texture because that brings back a whole lot of stuff. If I've worked on getting rid of noise, I probably am not going to deal with texture. but clarity a little bit. It kind of pumps up the local contrast, you know, in specific areas a little bit. Vibrance. Again, vibrance will increase the color intensity, but not as much as saturation. Saturation just goes across the board, you know. Vibrance is like saturation with a brain, and so it decides on areas that it thinks need more vibrance and just increases the color saturation in those areas. Okay. So I've worked on this image a fair amount, and I can see things that still need doing. You know, I might adjust the colors in her face, for example, and I would do that by using the adjustment brush and come in here and select that, and maybe come in closer so I can see it better. So perhaps I will open that up, and also, you know, her face is kind of orangey, so I'm going to bring that down a little bit. Ooh, that's not quite what I meant to do. But I'm reducing the tint in the, or I'm bringing it out of the, or away from magenta and into the green just a little bit. And in the color temperature, I've lowered it a bit. So here's where I started, and that's what it looks like now. And this is showing me the affected areas. And I can see that there are a few things that need a little cleaning up, so get rid of these here. Okay. Maybe open up the shadows just a bit, and so on. And if I'm happy with that, I will get out of that tool and look at the full frame and think, okay, that's pretty good. And finally, one thing that many photographers do is to darken the edges and the corners of the frame. And so if we go down to Effects, it says Post-Crop Vignetting. And in this way, you can darken or lighten the edges. And generally, you're not going to do this kind of crazy thing, but something much more subtle. In order to control this, let me just show you what it looks like. I'm going to turn the feathering off down to 0. And so this will give a hard line so you can see the areas that are affected. So with the amount slider, if you go all the way to the right, it turns white. If you go all the way to the left, it turns black. The midpoint slider allows you to adjust how much is affected. And I usually have it out around here. Roundness, you can make it a circle, but most of our images are rectangular, so I have it kind of oblong. And then the feathering is, you know, how hard or soft the line is. And I usually have it somewhere in the middle. And then this is back to 0, essentially. And I usually vignette so yeah, somewhere so that it's just subtly darker, not a lot. And this kind of contains the image and draws the viewer's eyes into the frame instead of out at the edges. And so that's usually the last thing I do in an image. And of course I look at it again, and here's one thing that I think is really important, and it took me a while to learn to do this. Go back and look at it again the next day or the next week. Because I've found for me what I thought looked great when I did it may look not so great when I go back to it. So I do go back and look at it again. We didn't talk about color temperature earlier because we hadn't gone over it yet, but just under the those tools that we were using, it says WB for white balance. So here you can adjust the color temperature into the blues or into the orange yellows. Again, if you double click on it, it goes back to where it had been. The color temperature is a little more to taste, but tint, which is below it, is not so much. The tint is something you don't want to play around with that much unless you're seeing a tint, a color tint. So I can see there's some magenta in here that I may not want, and so I might pull the tint down into the green area. If I'm seeing that the image is kind of green like that, I'll pull it up more into the magenta. But you don't want to see a tint, and this tint slider is used to correct for you know, green or magenta tints. Not, and it's not really to taste, it's that you don't want a tint, and that's, you use that to correct for it. Okay, so any questions? Anybody? Anybody? In that case, I will have my office hour on Wednesday, and I will post this assignment and your final assignment, which deals with working in Lightroom, and they are both due at the end of next week on June 26th. Also, I will post a study guide for the exam, which covers all of the technical stuff we've gone over, including white balance and color temperature, which we talked about today. The exam will be open all week next week, and I think you can retake it once if you want to. It's not supposed to be open book, but I don't know what you do when you're in the privacy of your own home. Obviously, you have to know enough to look it up and know where to find it. But I will post all of that. It's a multiple choice, obviously multiple choice exam, so the answers are there in front of you. Okay. All right. Any questions, comments, issues? All right, in that case, again, I'll have office hours Wednesday, 12:30 to 2:30. We will also have a Zoom meeting next Monday, and I will have office hours next Wednesday, even though it's finals week. So feel free to contact me that way or via email. Otherwise, have a delightful week and weekend. Shoot shoot pictures. Stay safe and healthy. Okay. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.